Hey, what's up, my fellow nerds? This is Alex here from redhotmtg, and I got another deck tech for you today. Now, Modern Horizons 2 is just around the corner, and there are a lot of awesome new cards for us to play with. One of those cards is the topic and commander of today's deck tech, and that card is Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer. Ragavan is a 2/1 legendary monkey pirate for only 1 red mana. It has, whenever Ragavan deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token and exile the top card of that player's library. Until end of turn, you may cast that card, and it has dash for 1 and a red. Having a 1 mana commander can be very powerful, and with a relevant effect like Ragavan's, even more so. You'll be able to cast him on turn 1 every single game, and start doing what your deck wants to do, which is make treasures and cast your opponent's stuff. My version of this deck can be summed up by red good stuff, but with a heavy lean into both of these effects. So with all that being said, let's get into the first category of cards. First couple of cards I'll be talking about are some other treasure creators. Treasure tokens can be very powerful in Commander as they help you ramp, and although they are only temporary ramp that you generally can't use more than once, they can help propel your game plan forward, especially in a mono red deck where your ramp options are very limited. You'll easily be able to make a lot of treasures throughout the game due to our commander's ability, but there are some other really good cards that can help us along even further. First up, there is Dockside Extortionist, arguably one of the best red spells ever printed. He is a 1/2 Goblin Pirate for 1 and red that has, whenever he enters the battlefield, create X treasure tokens, where X is the number of artifacts and enchantments your opponents control. He costs very little to bring out and can sometimes create a crazy amount of treasure tokens. And a lot of commander decks rely heavily on mana rocks to ramp, so you can typically get at least a few every time you play him. He is also a pirate, which is a subtle sub-theme of the deck and can actually have synergy with a few other cards in the deck, so watch out for those. Next up, we have Captain Lannery Storm and Magna Brazen Outlaw. Captain Lannery has haste, and whenever she attacks, create a treasure token. And also has, whenever you sacrifice a treasure, she gets +1/+0 until end of turn. This deck wants to be attacking and making treasures, so she fits in perfectly, and can sometimes get huge out of nowhere if you have a lot of treasures out. Now Magna has other dwarves get +1/+0, which is not very relevant because we only run one other dwarf, but she has, whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token, and also sacrifice 5 treasure, search your library for an artifact or dragon card, and put it onto the battlefield. She includes herself in this ability, so every time she attacks or becomes tapped in some other way, she will make a treasure. Also, there will be times when you have a lot of treasure and not much to do with them, so having an activated ability that lets you sacrifice 5 of them to tutor for a dragon is very relevant and powerful. There are some great dragons included in this list that are powerful on their own and synergize with the deck, so you should always have a target for this ability. And to talk about one of them, we have another card from Call Time, and that is Goldspan Dragon. Goldspan Dragon is a 4/4 dragon with flying and haste, and has, whenever Goldspan Dragon attacks or becomes the target of a spell or ability, create a treasure token. And treasures you control have tap and sacrifice, add 2 mana of any one color. So this 5 mana dragon is a great attacker that rewards us with extra treasure, has a downside for opponents that want to target it by giving us more treasure, and doubles the effectiveness of all of our treasure produced from anywhere else. And lastly, we have Brass's Bounty, which is a sorcery for 7 that has create a treasure token for each land you control. A very powerful spell that can create a lot of treasures for us and help us set up our following turns. Ragavan's other ability lets us steal our opponent's spells by impulse drawing from their library when he deals combat damage. So here are some other cards that let us play with our opponent's stuff. To start off, we have Breeches, Brazen Plunderer, Robber of the Rich, and Atali Primal Storm. Breeches has Menace, and whenever one or more pirates you control deals combat damage to your opponents, exile the top card of each of those opponents' libraries. You may play those cards this turn, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. So, Breeches has another effect that is similar to our commanders, except it activates when any pirate deals combat damage to a player, so this is one of those cards where the pirate sub-theme can really shine. It also has the clause, you can spend mana of any color to cast those spells, which our commander does not, so that is important to note. Robber of the Rich has Reach and Haste, and whenever Robber of the Rich attacks, if defending player has more cards in hand than you, exile the top card of their library. During any turn where you attacked with a rogue, you may cast that card and spend mana of any color to cast it. So, he is a little more conditional because they have to have less cards in hand to activate, but in an aggressive red deck like this, there should always be a player with more cards in hand than you.
He also gives the flexibility of being able to cast them on any turn that you attack with a rogue. He is the only rogue in the deck, but still nice to have the added flexibility. And Natali has this effect on steroids, with whenever he attacks, each player exiles the top card of their library, and you can cast those spells without paying their mana cost. Next up, we have Stolen Strategy, which gives us that impulse draw, similar to Ragavan's ability, during each of our upkeeps, and we can spend mana of any color to cast those spells. Then, we have Direfleet Daredevil, which does something a little different. He has, when it enters the battlefield, you can exile an instant or sorcery card from an opponent's graveyard, and you may cast that card this turn with any color of mana. So, he's kind of like an inverse Snapcaster Mage. Next up, we have a couple of cards that let us temporarily steal our opponent's creatures if they have something juicy out that we want. So, we have Coercive Recruiter, Captivating Crew, and Mob Rule. Coercive Recruiter is another of those pirate sub-themed payoffs with the ability whenever it or another pirate enters the battlefield under your control, gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap it, it gains haste, and becomes a pirate until the end of turn. So, with a lot of other pirates in the deck and our commander, this can be a repeatable active treason effect that also turns them into pirates as well. Captivating Crew is also repeatable because it has 3 in a red to active treason something at sorcery speed. Then, Mob Rule is a 6-drop sorcery that lets us active treason all of our opponent's creatures with either 4 or more power, or 3 or less power. This card could easily win you the game if your opponents have a sizable number of either of these creatures in that category. Then, to end this category out, we have Treasure Nabber and Hellkite Tyrant. Nabber says, whenever an opponent taps an artifact for mana, gain control of it until the end of your next turn. So, this could help us steal our opponent's mana rocks and give us extra value throughout a game. Then, Tyrant has, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, gain control of all artifacts they control, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. So this can be a great alternate win condition in the deck by just winning out of nowhere if you have enough artifacts, which you can easily do with the amount of treasures this deck should be able to make. But this card also just lets you take our opponent's artifacts for extra value. It is also a powerful dragon that would be a good target for Magda's ability.
As with any aggro deck, one of our main win conditions is through combat damage. So in this section, we will focus on cards that help us out in combat. First up, we have Aggravated Assault and Relentless Assault. Both of these cards give us extra combat steps in a turn, which is great for doubling up on the abilities we have that trigger during combat and for getting an extra damage during any given turn. Then we have 2 more creatures that give us extra combat steps with Port Raiser and Scourge of the Throne. Port Raiser gives us the ability to have an extra combat step for each opponent that we have if he attacks a different one each time, and has the added synergy of being a pirate. Scourge of the Throne is a little more conditional because it only activates once per turn and has to attack the player with the highest life total, but it does make itself bigger when it does due to its dethrone ability, and is a dragon that we can tutor up with Magda. Then we have some great pirate attackers with Kari Zev Skyship Raider, Fathom Fleet Swordjack, and Coastline Marauders. Kari Zev isn't the best card in Commander, but is super flavorful, as Ragavan is her pet monkey, and when she attacks, she actually makes a temporary 2/1 legendary monkey token named Ragavan that's tapped and attacking too. Fathom Fleet Swordjack deals additional damage to whoever it's attacking based on the number of artifacts we control. Then, Coastline Marauders gets +1/+0 based on the number of lands the opponent being attacked controls, and has Trample, so it can get very big and almost guarantee a little damage through every time he attacks. It also has Encore, which can be relevant late game as a finisher to swing big at each of our opponents. Next, we have Subira Tulzidi Caravaner, which has haste and lets us pay 1 to make a creature with power 2 or less unblockable until the end of turn, which helps us get our commander and other low power creatures through cluttered board states. It also lets us refill our hand with its last ability of 1, red, tap, and discard your hand. Whenever a creature with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Now this is pretty risky though, so you're going to have to make sure you can guarantee a couple card draws before activating this. And finally, we have a couple of the swords with Sword of Feast and Famine, Fire and Ice, and Hearth and Home. Any of the swords would work in this deck because the +2/+2 and protection from 2 colors can help us get our creatures through in combat and for additional damage. But these are the ones that I decided on based on the additional effects that activate when the equipped creature deals combat damage. Feast and Famine forces our opponents to discard a card, and we get to untap all of our lands. Fire and Ice deals 2 additional damage to any target, and we can also draw a card. And then Hearth and Home lets us blink a creature and search our library for a basic and put it onto the battlefield. Combat damage is the main win condition for this deck, but red is also very good at getting in extra damage as well. So to start off, we have Torbrand, Thane of Redfell. This 2/4 legendary dwarf adds 2 additional damage when any of our red sources deals damage, which can definitely add up throughout the course of a game. This is one of my favorite red cards, and I find myself slotting it into most decks that run red, even with the restrictive triple red casting cost, because of how effective it is. Then we have Jai's Immolating Inferno, Fanatic of Mogus, and Price of Progress. With all of the mana we can create in a game with our treasures, Jai's Immolating Inferno is a great place to dump it all to try and take out all 3 of our opponents at once, or at least get them pretty low. Fanatic of Mogus deals damage equal to our devotion to red when he enters the battlefield, which can be a very large amount when we have our board built up. And the Price of Progress hits all players with damage equal to the number of non-basics they control. As a mono red deck, this card will typically deal little to no damage to you, but can be super punishing to your opponents that are running a lot of non-basics to make sure that they can hit all of their colors in a multicolored deck. And finally, we have 2 more creatures with Emberwild Captain and Terror of the Peaks. Emberwild Captain is a pirate that makes us the monarch when it enters the battlefield, which can be a great source of card advantage to an aggro deck like this. And also, it threatens our opponents that try to attack us when we are the monarch with damage equal to the number of cards in their hand. And then Terror of the Peaks is an awesome dragon card that deals damage to any target whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control based on their power, and also forces our opponents to pay 3 extra life if they want to target it. It can also be noted that this is a great target to tutor out with Magda's ability. Ramp in any commander deck is very important to help you cast more spells in a game and hopefully lead you to victory. Treasure is a great form of ramp, but some more permanent forms of ramp are also recommended. So to start off, we have Soul Ring and Warm Power Stone, both of which tap for 2 colorless. Now, many commander content creators recommend 2 mana value mana rocks so that you can ramp out your commander earlier, but since ours only costs 1, we can use some more expensive mana rocks to help us ramp into big turns and make sure we'll be able to play our opponent's spells. Speaking of which, our next mana rock is Chromatic Lantern. Usually this is run in decks with 3 or more colors because it allows our lands to tap for any color, and it's pretty useless in any monocolored decks. But the reason that I'm including it in this list is because it helps us cast the spells exiled with Ragavan. We have to have access to the correct colors to cast these spells, and while Treasure will usually do the trick, this is some extra insurance that still has utility itself by being able to tap for mana. Next up is Hedron Archive and Cursed Mirror. Hedron Archive taps for 2 colorless and lets us cash it in for 2 cards for 2 mana if we don't need it anymore. Cursed Mirror is an excellent new mana rock that costs 3 and taps for 1 red, but when it enters the battlefield it can become a copy of any creature on the battlefield. So, it's good early and late game unlike many other mana rocks. Next, there's Gauntlet of Power. When we play it, we can choose red and make all of our basic mountains tap for double, and it has the added utility of powering up all of our red creatures by +1/+1. Then we have Inspiring Statuary, which is a 3 mana artifact that has non-artifact spells you cast have Inspire. Throughout the video I've been saying that our treasures are temporary ramp because they sacrifice themselves when you use them. But with this out we can use all of them for mana without sacrificing them, which can allow us to have huge turns multiple times in a row. Then we have Ruby Medallion, which costs 2 and reduces all of our red spells by 1 mana. As almost all of the spells in the deck are red, this can save us a tremendous amount of mana throughout a game. Also, if we're playing against any red players, the spells that we cast from them will also be discounted. And finally, we have 2 creature ramp cards with Runaway Steamkin and Solemn Simulacrum. Steamkin can allow us to go off by producing a crazy amount of mana because every time we cast a red spell, it can say +1/+1 counter, and we can remove 3 of these to add 3 red to our mana pool. And then Solemn gets us a basic land from our deck onto the battlefield when it comes into play, and draws us an additional card when it dies. Next, we have some spells that prevent our opponents from doing what they want to do. So first up, we got Chaos Warp and Vandal Blast. Chaos Warp is a 3-drop instant speed removal spell that gets rid of any permanent, but it comes with the drawback that our opponents can reveal the top card of their library, and if it's a permanent card, they can put it onto the battlefield. So make sure you save this spell for when you really need it. And then Vandal Blast is a 1-drop sorcery that can destroy any of our opponent's artifacts, or it can be overloaded for 4 in a red to get rid of all of our opponent's artifacts. This is a great anti-artifact spell in red.
Then we have 3 board wipes with Blasphemous Act, Rolling Earthquake, and Mizium Mortars. I'd always recommend having at least a couple board wipes in your deck because sometimes these are the only spells that can get you back into the game. And Blasphemous Act is one of the best board wipes in the game in my opinion, regardless of color. The ability to wipe the board for only 1 mana is tremendous. Now, Blasphemous Act technically costs 9, but with its effect that it costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield, it will almost always cost 1 in Commander. Honestly, I've never seen it cast for more than 1. Then we have Rolling Earthquake, which is the best X-costed board wipe in my opinion, because it hits almost every creature that doesn't have horsemanship that is, and it also hits all of our opponents. And lastly, Mizium Mortars is a very underrated board wipe in my opinion. It has the flexibility to be cast for cheaper to remove a single target, or it can be overloaded for 6 to deal 4 damage to each of our opponent's creatures. Now that part is very important because our other 2 board wipes hit all of our creatures, but if we have a board built up, we don't want to get rid of it. So this, dealing 4 damage to only our opponent's creatures, can be a huge swing in tempo in the game, and usually 4 damage is enough to kill everything that our opponents will have. In this section, we will talk about all the spells that did make it into our other categories. And first up, we have a couple wheels with Reforge the Soul, Wheel of Misfortune, and Magnus of the Wheel. Each of these cards allow us to discard our hand to draw a new hand of 7. Now, Wheel of Misfortune is a little conditional because we have to play a little mini game with our opponents to actually get the wheel effect to go off for us, but there's generally always at least one player at the table who doesn't want a wheel, so they'll pick a low number. Then, we have a very flexible spell with Valakut Awakening / Valakut Stronghold. The Valakut Awakening side lets us put any number of cards from our hand on the bottom of our library, and then we draw that many cards plus 1. So this card doesn't give us any card advantage, but it helps us get rid of any dead cards that we have, and it has the flexibility of being played as a land with the Valakut Stronghold side if we need to hit our land drops. Then, we have 2 rituals with Mana Geyser and Jeska's Will. Mana Geyser is a 5-drop sorcery spell that reads, add red to your mana pool for each tapped land your opponents control. And in a multiplayer format like Commander, this number will usually be double digits. And then we have a 3-drop sorcery with Jeska's Will that has 2 modes. The first one reads, add red to your mana pool for each card in target opponent's hand. And the second one reads, exile the top 3 cards of your library, and you may play them this turn. It also has the very powerful text line that says, if you control a commander as you cast the spell, you may choose both modes. So, for only 3 mana, this card will ramp us and give us card advantage. This is probably the best red spell that Wizards has printed in a long time, and I'm very glad, because red has needed some extra help in the card advantage department. And next up, we have 3 utility creatures with Imperial Recruiter, Causal Tyrant of the Cliffs, and Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. Imperial Recruiter is a 3-drop that lets us tutor for a creature with power 2 or less when it enters the battlefield. Causal reads, whenever an opponent wants to attack us with a creature, they have to either pay 3 or let us create a 3/3 Ogre token. This is usually enough to prevent our opponents from attacking us, which is very good because we want to be tapping out to hit our opponents every turn and not be worried about the crackback. Then, Kiki-Jiki is just a great utility card in red that has haste and tap, put a creature token into play that's a copy of target non-legendary creature you control. That token gains haste and sacrifice it at the end of turn. This helps us get more attackers every turn, get extra value out of creatures that have ETB effects, and it's also worth noting that it will go infinite with Coercive Recruiter. And after that, we have a very flexible Planeswalker with Chandra Torch of Defiance. She has 3 main modes that either give us card advantage, ramp us, or can act as spot removal. Then if you happen to get her ultimate off, you're probably going to win the game just for the sheer amount of damage that they can output. And then we have Faithless Looting, which is just a good spell that helps us get to the cards that we need when we need them. And here we have Lithoform Engine, a very flexible artifact spell that has 3 different modes. The first one reads, 2 tap, copy target activated or triggered ability you control, and you may choose new targets for the copy. And this mode is the main reason the card is in the deck, so that we can get more activations off of Ragavan. The next ability reads, 3 tap, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control, and you may choose new targets for the copies. So we do run a couple instants and sorceries, and this could come in handy if we need it. And then the final ability reads, 4 tap, copy target permanent spell you control. And we have a lot of permanents in this deck, so this also could come in handy. Next up, we have 2 2-drop enchantments. The first one is Goblin Bombardment, which says sacrifice a creature, Goblin Bombardment deals 1 damage to target creature or player. Now this is great to help us get extra value out of our creatures that are already about to die, or to get that last bit of damage in. And then Underworld Breach says each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to its mana cost, plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. At the beginning of your end step, sacrifice Underworld Breach. So this spell is like a budget version of Yawgmoth's Will in red, and helps us play any of our things that have died throughout the game, or have been put to our graveyard from anywhere else. And finally, we have 2 4-drop enchantments with Outpost Siege and Worst Toll. An Outpost Siege has 2 modes that we can choose from when it enters the battlefield. The first one is an impulse draw on each of our upkeep, and the second one says whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, Outpost Siege deals 1 damage to target creature or player. So both of these are very good, although you're probably going to be picking the card advantage one most of the time because a mono red deck definitely needs it. And then War's Toll has 2 abilities that say whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, tap all lands that player controls, and if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attack if able. Now this is just a good red spell to play in general because it only affects our opponents and it can really hinder their game plans, especially when it comes to interacting on our turn. But in an aggro deck like this, we can definitely take advantage of both effects by feeling free to do whatever we want to do, and if our opponents want to attack, it can clear out some potential blockers. Now, the mana base for monocolored decks is usually pretty easy because you don't have to worry about trying to produce multiple different colors. So you can utilize a lot of different kinds of lands, including colorless utility ones. So I'm just going to quickly go through the ones that I put in my list, but know that there are a lot of other options that you could put into yours. So first up we have Hanwar Garrison and Flamekin Village. Hanwar Garrison taps for colorless, Flamekin Village taps for red, and they both have the activated ability of red, tap, give target creature haste until end of turn. I find myself trying to slot these into any red deck that I build these days simply because the ability to give a creature haste until end of turn can be very powerful, especially in aggro decks with powerful creatures such as Atali, Portraiser, and Scourge of the Throne, which need to attack to get their triggers. War Room gives us the option to pay 3 mana and 1 life to draw a card if we need to. Dwarven Mind makes a 1/1 dwarf creature token when it comes into the battlefield untapped. Kur Keep allows you to pay 2 to get a 0/1 Kobold Body. Castle Embrith can be used to pump all of your creatures for a turn. Arcane Lighthouse can make your opponent's creatures targetable if they have Hexproof or Shroud. It can be a great card to get you some goodwill with the table if it's used politically. Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God can both tap for 2 colorless mana, which is a solid form of ramp in this deck. But speaking about ramp on our land cards, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx is probably the best land in the deck, because if you have nothing out, it still taps for 1 colorless, but if you build up your board, it can easily tap for a lot of mana. Myriad Landscape is another solid option in decks that don't have green to get some land-based ramp. Shinka the Bloodsoak Keep has great utility in being able to give target legendary creature first strike, which can make combat a lot more difficult for our opponents. Then, Forgotten Caves and other red lands with Cycle are good when you're flooded and need to get other stuff, but can still be played as lands if you need to hit your land drops. And finally, I'm running 24 basic mountains. So that was my whole deck list for Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, but there are many other cards that could work great in this deck. If budget is a concern on any of the cards mentioned above, you could also consider replacing them with any of these. For some extra pirates, you could consider Impulsive Pilferer, Wily Goblin, or Angrass Marauders. Balefire Dragon and Drakaseth, Maw of Flames are some more solid dragons. For some other removal options, you could consider Lightning Bolt, Abrade, or Goblin Crater Maker. Blood Moon or Magnus of the Moon are great mono-red options if you want to be mean. Zealous Conscripts could give you more consistency if you want to lean into the Kiki Jiki combo. And Gamble is a very solid red tutor. So that is everything that I have for you today, so I hope that you enjoyed. It is a really fun deck that gives you card advantage in a really unique way and makes every game feel different. And it has the added benefit of not being very oppressive to your opponents. Plus, he's the first legendary monkey in the game, which I know you all have been waiting for just like me. So, let me know what you think of this list and what your recommended cards would be in the comments below. Consider subscribing if you liked the video because I have a lot more deck techs on the way and a box opening of Modern Horizons 2 coming soon. So thanks again and see you next time.